In the era before penicillin, Buddhist monasteries were communities of hundreds or thousands of people living in extremely close quarters, sharing food, sharing water, sharing air. By the logic of modern epidemiology, they should have been devastated by infectious disease. Many were not, and the records of why are sitting in monastery medical texts that most modern microbiologists have never read. Here is something almost nobody in the antibiotic resistance conversation talks about. The Javaka tradition, named for the Buddha's personal physician, documented antimicrobial preparations with a specificity that was not matched in Western medicine for over 1,000 years. Specific plants, specific preparations, specific dosing protocols for specific infections. And modern microbiology is now running these same compounds through clinical trials. The results keep producing the same jaw-dropping finding. These plants kill pathogens through mechanisms so sophisticated that modern bacteria have enormous difficulty developing resistance to them. Stay with me, because number 6 contains the only natural compound shown in published trials to be active against the bacterium that causes tuberculosis. And number 3 disrupts the exact communication system that bacteria use to mount chronic, treatment-resistant infections. 10 monastery medicines. Starting now. Number 10. Andrographis, called Kalmegh in Sanskrit, the bitter plague killer. The Karaka Samhita's premier herb for fever and infection. When monks fell ill with what the texts call burning fever sickness, Andrographis was the first intervention. Not for chronic conditions, for acute, life-threatening, infectious disease. The bitter decoction was administered at the onset of fever and continued for 5 to 7 days. Never longer, never preventively. This was a precise, short-course therapeutic. Read that again slowly. A specific medicine, a specific window of use, documented protocols that read like modern antibiotic prescribing guidelines written 2,000 years ago. That tells you everything about how Andrographis was valued. It was not an herbal supplement. It was the monastery's emergency infection medicine. Modern pharmacology has now identified the active compound and its mechanism. The compound is andrographilide. It is one of the most broadly studied natural antimicrobials in modern published research. Andrographilide has demonstrated activity against MRSA, the methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus that defeats modern antibiotics. It has shown activity against influenza viruses. It has shown activity against the HIV virus in laboratory studies. And it has been studied for activity against malaria parasites. Here is the key detail. Andrographilide does not work through a single mechanism. It disrupts multiple pathogen pathways simultaneously, which makes resistance development extraordinarily difficult. Most modern antibiotics target one bacterial mechanism. Bacteria evolve around that one mechanism. Andrographilide targets several at once. Before anyone had a word for multi-pathway antimicrobial action, Ayurvedic physicians were prescribing it through a bitter decoction. 3 ways to use it. Brew the bitter decoction at the first sign of acute infection. The traditional dose is 1 teaspoon of dried herb in hot water, taken 3 times daily. Use it for 5 to 7 days only. This is therapeutic, not preventive. Long-term use is not the traditional protocol. Combine with raw honey to mask the intense bitterness. The honey also contributes its own antimicrobial activity. The taste is the warning. The medicine is the bitterness itself. Number 9. Neem, called Nimba in Sanskrit. Azadirachta indica, the universal pathogen destroyer. The Sushruta Samhita lists neem in more antimicrobial formulations than any other single plant. More than any other. This is significant in an ancient text that cataloged hundreds of medicinal compounds. The reason was clinical observation across centuries. Neem worked against everything. Bacterial infections, fungal infections, viral infections, parasitic infections. The leaves were chewed. The bark was decocted. The oil was applied topically. Different parts of the same tree prepared differently for different infections. Read that again slowly. A single tree used in dozens of different antimicrobial preparations by physicians who had no microscopes but extensive clinical observation. That tells you everything about how neem was valued. It was not an herb. It was the monastery's broad-spectrum infection arsenal. Modern microbiology has confirmed every aspect of this ancient use. Over 200 published studies have demonstrated neem's antimicrobial activity. The primary active compounds are nimbidin and nimbolide. Together, they show measurable activity against gram-positive bacteria, gram-negative bacteria, fungi, viruses, and malaria parasites. In 200 studies, across multiple research institutions, confirmed independently. And here is the detail almost nobody mentions. The classical monastery practice of chewing fresh neem leaves at dawn was not symbolic. The active compounds are most concentrated when the leaves are fresh and the cellular structure is intact. Drying degrades them somewhat, crushing releases them. The morning chew was both a delivery method and a daily prophylactic dose. Before anyone had a word for broad-spectrum antimicrobials, Ayurvedic monks were chewing one every morning before sunrise. 3 ways to use it. Chew 3 to 5 fresh neem leaves at dawn on an empty stomach. The classical monastery prophylactic dose. Apply neem oil topically to skin infections, wounds, and fungal conditions. The traditional external use. Brew bark or leaf decoction for gut infections and parasitic conditions. Use therapeutically, not daily. 200 published studies. One ancient tree. Confirmed across modern microbiology. Number 8. Holy basil, called Tulsi in Sanskrit, the membrane disruptor. Every monastery in South and Southeast Asia grew Tulsi, not in the kitchen, in the temple courtyard. The plant was tended with the same care given to ritual objects because it was understood to be both sacred and pharmaceutical. When monks contracted respiratory infections, gut infections, or skin infections, Tulsi was the first intervention. Tea for systemic infections. Crushed leaves for topical application. Fresh juice for acute conditions. Read that again slowly. A plant grown in temple courtyards across an entire continent, specifically because it was the most reliable antimicrobial herb in the monastery pharmacy. That tells you everything about how Tulsi was valued. It was not a sacred symbol. It was the queen of antibiotics, hidden in plain sight. Modern microbiology has identified the mechanism. The primary active compound is eugenol. Eugenol disrupts bacterial cell membranes through a mechanism similar to broad-spectrum antibiotics, but without promoting resistance development. This is the critical distinction. When bacteria are exposed to most modern antibiotics, the survivors evolve. Future generations of that bacterium become resistant. Eugenol's mechanism is structural, not biochemical. Bacteria cannot easily evolve a different cell membrane. Clinical studies confirm Tulsi's activity against E. coli, Staphylococcus aureus, Salmonella, and the fungal pathogen Candida albicans. Multiple infections, one herb, no documented resistance development. Before anyone had a word for membrane-disrupting antibiotics, Buddhist monks were cultivating one in every monastery courtyard on the continent. 3 ways to use it. Brew Tulsi tea twice daily during respiratory infections. Steep 5 to 7 leaves in hot water for 5 minutes. Apply crushed fresh leaves to skin infections topically. The eugenol works directly on contact. Chew 3 fresh leaves daily, as preventive practice. The classical monastery tradition for prophylaxis. The Atharva Veda called it the Queen of Herbs. Modern microbiology is confirming the title. Number 7. Garlic, called rasona in Sanskrit, the raw, crushed antibiotic. The Charaka Samhita lists garlic in 28 separate antimicrobial formulations. 28. For wound infections, respiratory infections, gut infections, and fevers of unknown origin. But there is one detail that the ancient texts emphasize repeatedly. The garlic must be raw. It must be freshly crushed. Heated garlic was understood to lose its medicinal property. Stored crushed garlic was understood to weaken with time. Read that again slowly. A specific preparation requirement, repeated across multiple ancient texts, with the consistency of a chemistry instruction, written 2,000 years before chemistry existed as a discipline. That tells you everything about how garlic was valued. It was not a flavor. It was a precision medicine that required precision preparation. Modern biochemistry explains exactly why the ancient instructions mattered. The primary antimicrobial compound in garlic is allicin. Allicin does not exist in intact garlic cloves. It is produced by an enzymatic reaction that occurs only when the cells of the garlic are crushed. The enzyme alliinase converts the precursor compound allicin into allicin. Heat destroys both alliinase and allicin. Storage causes allicin to degrade rapidly. This is why the ancient prescription was always raw and freshly crushed. Allicin has demonstrated activity against 23 bacterial species in modern clinical studies, including MRSA strains that resist multiple pharmaceutical antibiotics. It is one of the broadest spectrum natural antimicrobials ever identified. Before anyone had a word for enzyme-substrate reactions, Ayurvedic physicians were specifying the exact preparation that produced one. 3 ways to use it. Crush 2 to 3 raw garlic cloves and consume immediately for acute infection. The traditional acute illness prescription: mix freshly crushed garlic with raw honey to mask intensity. The honey also adds its own antimicrobial action. Never cook garlic when using it as medicine. The flavor remains, but the antimicrobial activity does not. The supplement industry sells you aged garlic capsules with no allicin. The monks knew that does not work. Number 6. Black seed, Nigella sativa, the tuberculosis killer. This seed sits at the most extraordinary intersection of medical traditions in human history. It was documented in Buddhist medical texts. It was documented in Islamic medical texts. The Prophet Muhammad called it a cure for every disease except death. Both traditions traveled the Silk Road. Both arrived independently at the same conclusion. But the Buddhist medical record contains a specific use that was not documented elsewhere. Black seed was prescribed during outbreaks of what the ancient texts call wasting cough sickness. This is the disease that modern medicine calls tuberculosis. In the medieval period, tuberculosis decimated monastic communities across Asia. Monks who consumed black seed daily were observed to be measurably more resistant to the disease. Read that again slowly. A specific seed prescribed across 2 civilizations for a disease that killed thousands of monks before antibiotics existed. That tells you everything about how black seed was valued. It was not a culinary ingredient. It was the monastery's tuberculosis defense. Modern clinical research has now confirmed the ancient observation. The active compound is thymoquinone. Thymoquinone has demonstrated activity against Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the bacterium that causes TB, in published clinical trials. This is significant because tuberculosis is one of the hardest bacterial infections in modern medicine to treat. The current pharmaceutical regimen requires 4 drugs taken simultaneously for 6 to 9 months. Thymoquinone shows direct antibacterial activity against the same pathogen. It also demonstrates activity against drug-resistant Staphylococcus strains. And here is the detail almost nobody mentions. Black seed oil, when consumed daily as a preventive, builds an antimicrobial baseline in the body that the ancient physicians had observed and documented for centuries. It was prophylactic, not just therapeutic. Before anyone had a word for prophylactic antimicrobial therapy, Buddhist and Islamic physicians were administering one through daily teaspoons of cold-pressed oil. 3 ways to use it. Take 1 teaspoon of cold-pressed black seed oil daily as preventive practice. Add whole seeds to food, the traditional daily monastery use. Increase the dose to 2 teaspoons during respiratory illness for therapeutic effect, the traditional acute protocol. 2 civilizations agreed on this seed independently. Modern microbiology is finally explaining why. We are halfway through. Every medicine remaining on this list has been tested in modern clinical trials. Everyone passed. Subscribe and hit the bell. We post every single week. The next video goes even deeper. Now, number 5. Licorice root, called Yashtamadhu in Sanskrit, the antiviral defender. The Sushruta Samhita lists licorice in over 70 antimicrobial formulations. 70. This is one of the highest formulation counts for any single herb in the entire Ayurvedic canon. The reason was clinical observation. Licorice worked against viral infections at a time when viruses had not been discovered. The ancient physicians could not see viruses, but they could observe that monks with what the texts call wet lung sickness recovered faster when given licorice root decoction. The same was true for skin eruptions consistent with herpes outbreaks. The same was true for the liver inflammations that we now know to be viral hepatitis. Read that again slowly. A specific herb, observed across centuries to work against diseases that 20th century science would later identify as viral. That tells you everything about how licorice was valued. It was not a flavoring. It was the monastery's antiviral medicine. Modern virology has now confirmed the ancient observation. The active compound is glycyrrhizin. Glycyrrhizin has documented antiviral activity against hepatitis B, hepatitis C, herpes simplex, influenza A and B, and in laboratory settings, the SARS coronavirus family. Multiple viruses, one compound. And here is the detail almost nobody mentions. Glycyrrhizin also prevents bacterial biofilm formation. Biofilms are the defense structures that bacteria build to make chronic infections resistant to treatment. They are why some infections become impossible to clear. By preventing biofilm formation, licorice keeps acute infections from becoming chronic. Before anyone had a word for antiviral medication, Ayurvedic physicians were prescribing one for respiratory infections, hepatitis, and herpes outbreaks. 3 ways to use it. Brew licorice root decoction during respiratory infections. Steep 1 teaspoon of dried root in hot water for 10 minutes. Use it therapeutically, not daily long-term. Pure licorice in high doses can affect blood pressure. Use deglycyrrhizinated licorice if daily use is desired. This form removes the blood pressure effect while preserving most other benefits. 70 formulations in one ancient text. Modern virology is finally explaining all of them. Number 4. Giloy, Tinospora cordifolia, also called Guduchi, the divine nectar. The Charaka Samhita gives Giloy a name reserved for almost no other herb in the entire Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia. Amrita, the divine nectar of immortality. This name was used for substances believed to grant the highest possible medicinal benefit. The reason Giloy received this designation was its observed effect during epidemic outbreaks. When fevers swept through monastic communities, monks who had been taking Giloy preventively were observed to be measurably more resilient than those who had not. The herb was prescribed before the epidemic, not just during. Read that again slowly. A prophylactic medicine given to healthy monks specifically to prevent infection in communities that documented their disease patterns across generations. That tells you everything about how Giloy was valued. It was not an immune supplement. It was the monastery's epidemic season prophylactic. Modern immunology has identified the mechanism. Giloy contains alkaloids related to berberine. These alkaloids activate macrophages and natural killer cells, the immune system's first responders to infection, while simultaneously demonstrating direct antibacterial action. This is a dual mechanism. The herb both strengthens the immune response and directly attacks pathogens. And here is the detail almost nobody mentions. The ancient texts specified the use of fresh Giloy stem juice during epidemic season. The fresh juice contains the highest concentration of active alkaloids. Drying degrades them somewhat. Standardized extracts vary widely in potency. The monastery preparation, fresh juice, was the most potent form. Before anyone had a word for immune modulation, Ayurvedic physicians were activating it with a fresh-pressed stem juice during disease outbreaks. 3 ways to use it. Press fresh Giloy stem juice and consume 30 milliliters daily during cold and flu season. Use standardized powder when fresh herb is unavailable, 500 milligrams to 1 gram daily. Combine with Tulsi for a complete immune enhancement protocol. The 2 herbs were often paired in the monastery pharmacy. The ancient texts called it the divine nectar. Modern immunology is confirming the title. Number 3. Turmeric, called Haridra in Sanskrit, the quorum-sensing disruptor. Egyptian medical papyri and the Charaka Samhita both documented turmeric for wound infections. The 2 civilizations were separated by 2,000 miles and 500 years. Neither had access to the other's medical traditions when these texts were first compiled. And yet both arrived at the same conclusion. Turmeric paste, applied directly to infected wounds, prevented the infection from becoming chronic. This was a clinical observation made independently in two of the oldest medical systems on Earth. Read that again slowly. Two ancient civilizations, separated by continents and centuries, identifying the same antimicrobial use of the same plant. That tells you everything about how turmeric was valued. It was not a spice. It was the universal wound medicine of the ancient world. Modern microbiology has finally explained the mechanism. The active compound is curcumin. Curcumin disrupts bacterial quorum sensing. Quorum sensing is the chemical communication system bacteria use to coordinate their behavior in large groups. It is the mechanism by which bacteria mount biofilm-based chronic infections. When you disrupt quorum sensing, bacteria cannot coordinate. They cannot form biofilms. They cannot mount the organized resistance that makes chronic infections nearly impossible to treat. Turmeric does this through diet and through topical application. Before anyone had a word for bacterial quorum sensing, Egyptian and Ayurvedic physicians were disrupting it with a yellow root applied directly to wounds. 3 ways to use it. Apply turmeric paste mixed with water or honey directly to infected wounds. The classical monastery first-line wound treatment. Drink turmeric water for systemic infections. The compound is active throughout the body when consumed. Always combine with black pepper for internal use. Piperine increases curcumin bioavailability by 2,000%. Two ancient civilizations agreed on this medicine. Modern microbiology has finally caught up. Number 2. Pomegranate Rind Tea. The forgotten GI antiseptic. This is the entry on this list that almost everyone in the modern world misses entirely, because almost everyone discards the pomegranate rind. The Charaka Samhita's physicians did not. The ancient texts specifically prescribed the dried, ground rind, brewed as a tea, for diarrheal illnesses and gut infections. When monks contracted what the texts call flowing belly sickness, the prescription was clear: dried pomegranate rind, steeped in boiling water, consumed 3 times daily until symptoms resolved. Read that again slowly. A specific use of a specific part of a specific fruit for a specific category of disease, prescribed across centuries by physicians who had refined the protocol through generations of clinical observation. That tells you everything about how pomegranate rind was valued. It was not waste. It was the monastery's gut antibiotic. Modern pharmacology has now identified why the rind, not the seeds, was the medicine. The pomegranate rind contains allicin at concentrations 3 to 4 times higher than the edible interior of the fruit. 3 to 4 times higher. These tannins have demonstrated activity against Salmonella, Escherichia coli, and Staphylococcus aureus in modern clinical trials. These are the bacteria that cause most cases of gastrointestinal infection worldwide. The monastery's prescription targeted exactly the right pathogens with the most concentrated source of the right active compound. And here's the detail almost nobody mentions. The active compounds are heat stable. The ancient brewing method, in boiling water for 15 minutes, did not destroy them. The preparation method was as precise as the prescription. Before anyone had a word for allicin, Buddhist physicians were brewing them in temple kitchens to treat dysentery. 3 ways to use it. Dry the rind of fresh pomegranates completely. Grind to powder and store in a sealed container. Steep 1 teaspoon of the dried powder in boiling water for 15 minutes for gut infections. Drink 3 times daily until symptoms resolve. The classical monastery acute illness protocol. The fruit you eat. The medicine is the part you throw away. Number 1. Ginger and honey paste. The triple mechanism wound killer. This is not a single ingredient. It is the monastery's emergency antimicrobial paste, the equivalent of a first aid kit in a small jar. The Charaka Samhita prescribes the combination as a standard preparation for acute illness. Fresh ginger juice, mixed with raw honey. Applied to wounds, consumed for respiratory infections. Used internally for gut infections. 1 preparation. Multiple uses. When traveling monks crossed the Himalayas, this paste was the medicine they carried above almost any other. When monastery cooks burned themselves on hot vessels, this paste was applied immediately. When monks contracted infections of any kind, This paste was the first response. Read that again slowly. A single preparation, used externally and internally for wounds, respiratory infections, and gut infections, across centuries of documented monastery practice. That tells you everything about how this combination was valued. It was not a folk remedy. It was the monastery's universal antimicrobial first response. Modern microbiology has now identified 3 separate mechanisms working in combination. Ginger contains gingerols, which disrupt bacterial cell membranes through the same physical mechanism as the monastery's other membrane-disrupting herbs. Raw honey contains hydrogen peroxide generated continuously by the enzyme glucose oxidase. It contains defensin 1, an antimicrobial peptide produced by the bees themselves. And it has a low water activity that creates an environment in which most bacteria simply cannot survive. 3 independent antimicrobial mechanisms in honey alone, plus the gingerol mechanism from the ginger. This is why even MRSA, the antibiotic-resistant bacterial strain that defeats most pharmaceutical drugs, cannot survive in raw honey environments. Before anyone had a word for multi-mechanism antimicrobial therapy, Buddhist physicians were combining 4 different antimicrobial mechanisms in one paste. 3 ways to use it. Mix fresh ginger juice with raw honey in equal parts. Apply directly to wounds for topical antimicrobial action. Consume 1 teaspoon of the same mixture for systemic infections. The combination works internally as well as externally. Always use raw honey. Processed honey has been heated above 40 degrees Celsius, which destroys defensin 1 and the glucose oxidase enzyme. Pasteurized honey is sweet liquid, not medicine. The monastery's first aid kit. 4 mechanisms. 1 small jar. 2,500 years of clinical refinement. The monks who designed these protocols lived in one of the most infectious environments imaginable. Dense communities, shared water, long pilgrimages through every climate. Their antimicrobial toolkit was not primitive guesswork. It was a sophisticated pharmacopoeia, refined across generations of direct clinical observation. In an era of accelerating antibiotic resistance, the monastery's medicines look less like history and more like the future. Modern microbiology is catching up, one trial at a time. Drop a comment below and tell me which medicine surprised you most. Subscribe and hit the bell. We post every week and we are just getting started.